Hi everyone, and welcome back to this second panel for our symposium Disruptions, a symposium on the state of Indigenous art writing. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm on Gadigal land and I pay my respects to the ancestors of the past, present and future. It's my great pleasure to introduce Clothilde Bullen, a great friend of mine and of the Power Institute. She is a Wadandi Noongar Badamaya Yamaji woman from Western Australia, and she's previously was curator of Indigenous art at the Art Gallery of Western Australia for over a decade. She co-curated the award-winning Djon exhibition, I Am the Old and the New, and is the curator of Richard Bell, You Can Go Now, which opened in June at the Museum of Contemporary Art. So thank you so much, Chloe, for moderating our panel today, and I'll hand it over to your capable hands. Thanks.
Thanks, Stephen. Hello, welcome everyone. It is lovely to not see you all, but to have you here. We know you're here. I also just wanted to say that I'm appreciative of, I live and work off country. My country is Wadandi, Kanayang, Barimaya country, back home in the southwest of WA. And it's a real privilege to be able to live and work on Gadigal country, and I'm appreciative of the mob that allow me to be here, both ancestors and people living today. So thank you. This panel, this esteemed panel, I'm going to introduce everyone in a second, but this one's called Indigenous Art Writing, Writing Art, Writing Culture, and you'll find that it's probably quite different to the panel that went before. So we're trying to give you a full sort of range of things to talk about and ponder. I'm going to introduce our wonderful speakers who you probably all already know. These are incredible people who have done extraordinary things in Aboriginal arts and culture. None more so than Djon Mundine, of course. Now, I've got some written stuff, so forgive me if I'm not looking at the camera at the moment. But Djon Mundine is a proud Bundjalung man from the Northern Rivers of New South Wales. He's a curator, writer, artist and activist, and is celebrated as a foundational figure in the criticism and exhibition of contemporary Aboriginal art. And might I say too, one of our key mentors and people that we have looked to, who's been a curator for a very, very long time and paved the way for all of us to be here. Mundine has held many senior curatorial positions in both national and international institutions, some of which include the National Museum of Australia, the Museum of Contemporary Art, where I am at the moment, the Art Gallery of New South Wales and Campbelltown Art Centre. Djon was the art advisor at Milingimbi and curator at Bulla Arts in Ramingining, Arnhem Land, and was also the producer of the Aboriginal Memorial at the National Gallery of Australia. In 1993, Djon received the Medal of the Order of Australia, and in 2020, the Red Ochre Award for Lifetime Achievement. That's pretty astounding and amazing. Kim, I will speak to you. Kim is a Yorta Yorta curator, writer and senior curator for Southeastern Aboriginal Collections at Museums Victoria and artistic associate for Rising Festival Melbourne. Unfortunately, some of that, of course, got locked down, but some people did get to see a bit of it. It was pretty spectacular. Kim works with knowledge, histories and futures at the intersection of First Peoples historical and contemporary art and making. Kim's undertaken curatorial and writing research fellowships across Europe, the UK, the USA, South Asia and North America, when we used to be able to travel. And it was in 2019 that she won the Power Institute Indigenous Art Writing Award. And I was one of the people on that selection panel and remember that work well. In 2020, Kim was the commissioning co-editor for ArtLink Indigenous. It was called Kin Constellations, Languages, Waters, Futures. She is an alumni member of the Wesfarmers Indigenous Leadership Program at the National Gallery of Australia, the deputy chair of the Shepparton Art Museum Board, and member of the board for the International Art Critics Association, the Australian component of that, which is UNESCO funded. Cara Pinchbeck is a Gamilaroi curator, worked in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander art for over 20 years and is currently a senior curator at the Art Gallery of New South Wales. Central to her curatorial practice is ensuring cultural authority is acknowledged and respected and working collaboratively with artists and communities to develop mutually beneficial projects. And we touched on that a little bit in the previous panel, and we might touch on that a little bit more in this one. She was an executive producer of Faboriginal, which I hope people got to see. It was incredible. An art quiz show for National Indigenous Television in 2020. Cara's exhibitions and publications include Nongana Marawili, From My Heart and Mind, Art from Milingimbi, Taking Memories Back, When Silence Falls, and Yirkala Drawings. Cara is currently focused on the expansion and re-envisaging of the Art Gallery of New South Wales, ensuring that greater prominence is afforded to Indigenous art, knowledge and perspectives. So that's a mouthful, but I guess it's important to let people know what these guys have done, because I guess where we're speaking from is being centred in Aboriginal culture, in our own cultures, and obviously in Aboriginal art writing. So that's a very different place to be than it is from writing about Aboriginal art and culture from an outsider's perspective. So that places us well within that. I guess, you know, the big question, or the question that I want to talk to the panel about for this time, is very broadly how can the personal and political histories of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples be embedded in art criticism within a sovereign framework that centres our own voice? Before we get on to that very, very big topic, I know that our panellists have a PowerPoint to share. So, Cara, I might start with you, if that's okay, if you wouldn't mind sharing.
Thanks so much, Chloe, for that lovely introduction, and Stephen as well. Okay, hopefully you're seeing that in full screen now. So I thought I'd just give you a little bit of background to the writing that I was acknowledged for through the Power Institute, which is a publication called Art from Milingimbi, Taking Memories Back. And it was connected to an exhibition that we had at the Art Gallery of New South Wales in 2016. But it was a project that began many years before that in Milingimbi. And I would like to acknowledge that this project and the publication is very much a collaboration with people from Milingimbi, people connected to Milingimbi art and culture, and the families of the artists who I was working with. And I would really like to acknowledge their contribution to this project, because without them it just wouldn't have happened and wouldn't be what it became, and couldn't have sort of panned out as it did. And I guess I began this project because I'd been working at the gallery, and we have an amazing collection of works within the collection from Milingimbi, hundreds of objects that came into the collection in the 1960s predominantly, and were made over sort of a 10-year period in the 50s and into the 60s. And the bulk of the collection came from the personal collection of Reverend Wells, who you see here, who spent 10 years in Milingimbi and was really connected with people in the community and with the artists, and encouraged the making of artwork in Milingimbi, and acquired a personal collection, which he then sold a portion of to the Art Gallery of New South Wales. And the collection includes, you know, amazing works by these really phenomenal artists who I personally didn't know enough about, and didn't think they'd been as acknowledged as they could be within the art world. And also within the collection, there were many paintings that had very limited details on them. And these are two of those works that before this project were attributed to unknown artists and had really pathetic titles like art painting. So I was really wanting to find out more about these works, find out who the artists were if possible, and then really leave the conversation open in terms of what that could lead to. As an Aboriginal curator working at the gallery, I felt I had an obligation to try and ask the questions, to find answers as to who the artists were and what these works were about. And I was able to connect with really amazing people at Milingimbi, particularly Dr. Gumbala, who's since passed away, who was at that time undertaking an ARC research grant on 50 years of collecting from Milingimbi. So that tied into the project a little bit as well. So in 2014, I first went to Milingimbi and did a lot of work at Milingimbi Art and Culture. And really that first trip was about listening. It was about showing people images of the works, and then just listening to what was said about the works. I realised I knew nothing about the collection really, and it was my job to sit there, to allow the descendants of the artists to see these works, to have time to think about them, and then to offer information to me if they wanted too. And so the first few days were spent really just sitting, looking at people, flicking through pages of works in the collection and documenting anything that was offered to me in response. And it led to a really amazing ongoing sort of collaboration with people from Milingimbi, both in Milingimbi and in Sydney, where the works in the collection were considered. We looked at all the details, and over time, over a number of years, details were offered about various works in the collection. Artists were attributed to particular works, and we developed a really amazing body of documentation about the works in the collection. And people in Milingimbi really came to the conclusion that they wanted the individual artists who had made these works to be known and to be recognised. And so in those conversations together, we decided that an exhibition and publication would be amazing, and that the form of the exhibition and publication should be based on the individual artists and on current perspectives of the works in the collection from those who were most closely connected to those works. So an example of that is here with this amazing work by Tom Jawa, where his son gave me his feeling about the importance of this work, information on the subject matter within the work, and really that's what is captured within the publication and within my writing. I think really in terms of the publication, I'm just kind of an intermediary where I'm capturing the information that was shared with me and passing that on to the public, and also returning that information to the wider community of Milingimbi. And so over time, as I travelled back and forth between sort of Sydney and Milingimbi, it was constant sort of checking of information, people offering me more information about particular works, and really ensuring that people in Milingimbi, such as Jo Damaji, who's talking to me here, was really comfortable with the shape and nature of the information that I was capturing, and the sort of format that I had considered might work for sharing that with the public. And really, I mean, Jo was so involved in the exhibition and publication to the point that we even did, you know, a 3-metre long floor plan of the entire exhibition to locate each work within the exhibition space and have the publication echo that, so that it was as culturally appropriate and relevant as possible. And I guess within that process, there was a lot of time taken and a lot of conversations, and a really an open, honest exchange in terms of what this project could be, what the publication could be. And I think most important for me was the obligation I felt I had in terms of capturing what amazing people like Jo Damaji said about his father's works, about the wider art practice in Milingimbi, and then capturing that within the publication, really providing a format for Jo's words and Jo's knowledge and all of those, all of that information from his colleagues to be captured and shared within the publication, as well as people like Judy Liren, who was really involved in the project, hadn't necessarily seen her father's works before the exhibition, and really wanted to be engaged in the project to share knowledge of her father and for people to realise what amazing artists these men were. And so I guess in writing the publication, I was thinking about those conversations, the information that was shared, that process of building knowledge up over time, and the deep listening that goes into that, and the time that it takes. And really in terms of looking at this particular moment in Milingimbi's history and the collecting history, to offer a balanced perspective of that history that doesn't focus solely on the collector and the institution and their role in terms of these works coming into an institutional collection, but the agency of the artists and the role that they played in determining what works were shared and sold and are held in collections, and how we can appreciate the knowledge that was shared at the time these works were made from the perspective of the community and the family and the people that are most closely connected to those works. And I'll leave it there. I'll stop sharing now. Thanks, Chloe.
Thank you, Cara. There's so much to be talking about in those sorts of methodologies, not just in the actual recording of information and exhibition development, but also in the way we write about that as well. And I know there was a quote in your work, and I wrote it down actually. It said that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders curators heal the estrangement between people and their belongings. They restore, in inverted commas, and re-story. And I thought that was really pertinent to what we were talking about. We might sort of go back into that a little bit later. Djon, would you mind sharing your presentation, please, with us?
My name is Djon Mundine, or Mundine. As I've said before, I answer to both representations of my name, and people call me many names, I'm sure. So now I started to read and write a long time ago, of course. I started to write in Aboriginal art in the early 1980s. In 1979, I actually went to Milingimbi at the beginning of the year in Milingimbi in 1979, and began to work there as an art and craft advisor, as it was called then. And that place was most probably in the most of all the Arnhem Land places, it was most probably the most remote place. There were very few. There was a plane once or twice a week. Milingimbi, of course, is an island, and a very small island, in fact. And socially, most probably was an even smaller island. And what I began to do when I went there was because I had come from the southern states of Australia, and I'm an Aboriginal person who was born in the northern rivers of New South Wales, in Grafton, in fact. I'm a Bundjalung person. When I went there, I thought the thing that struck me about Aboriginal art was, as Cara was saying just before, was about the problem of trying to identify individual artists and how individual artist style, individual artist intelligence, and every individual artist personalities were not something that were really recorded and thought about as such. Maybe people might know their name, but they didn't really see them as a style, as a person of this style, of this subject matter, or they didn't see them of let alone a certain personality, and a person who likes this or that, or is quiet or outgoing, or was married or not married or whatever. They were mainly men that I worked with in that instance. But during the 1960s, a number of Aboriginal women came to work as painters, came to become painters in the Aboriginal art field. And in fact, much more prominently than most probably in the wider Western art world in the early 1960s. Now, those women were major painters within that Milingimbi Art Centre, and there were more women on the mainland and where I went to work later at Remenginning, and in Yirrkala, there was a whole set of a family who were painters. But so what I tried to do was to set out to take down autobiographies of people. I would interview artists and ask them these questions. All right, well, I set out to create biographies for artists, that what you would do with any other artist in the Western world, you'd mark out their career, their life and their career. Where did they first learn to paint? What was who were their teachers? Where were they born? But I'd also ask them where they went to school. Did they go to school at all? In a Western sense, did they go to school? where were their initiation ceremonies held, who went through those initiation ceremonies with them, when did they first get married, when did they have their first children, what work did they do. Many artists, of course, as in the Western art world or outside world, they worked at lots of different jobs. They mainly manual jobs. They broke horses, they herded cattle, they milked cows, they worked in the bakery, they worked in at farming and in constructing houses and lots of other laboring jobs. So those kinds of things I took down, and because of their peculiar situation at Milingimbi and then later at Ramingining, I would also ask, well, who was the missionary that you worked with? And the part of that was that then I could then reference that or correlate that to church records. I spent time in Darwin talking to the church, the Uniting Church in this instance, to find out a list of when this missionary was there, when that missionary was there. Not so much that I was in love with the missionaries. I was then I could then correlate that with the dates that artists were telling me. And that kind of information I was able to patch together without seeking special permission to have access to medical records and things like that are really private, or births, deaths, and marriages that are private things. No one can go and check your records on those instances. But what I ended up with, by the time I got to Ramingining, was that I had a set of most of the artists that I worked with, a couple of hundred people. I had a sketched out bio of these people and gave them life. They actually spent time in Darwin. They had lots of adventures. They were there when Milingimbi was bombed. Milingimbi was bombed during the Second World War by the Japanese. Where were they when that happened? I'd ask people those sorts of questions to tidemark this. So it was about creating a three-dimensional person, the artist as a three-dimensional person to start with. The other thing was to collate as much not of the knowledge systems that existed in Arnhem Land at the time. People, I would ask them, what is the name of that bird, or what is the name of that fish? I would also then correlate that with a Latin, the common English name for that bird, a cockatoo, of course, or a white corella, or a black cockatoo, or an eagle, hawk, etc., etc. But I also found the Latin name for that under that system. Now, people poked fun at me at the time. Other art advisors used to always say, as they don't, oh, that must be in Hengel and Melanaugusta, or something else. They'd make fun of the fact that I would write these names down on the back of the bark. And that was to emphasize the intelligence of the Aboriginal artist, the intelligence of the knowledge systems that existed at Milingimbi, Ramingining, and so on, and of Aboriginal people by extension, of Aboriginal people overall. So one of the major exhibitions I did, I started out trying to put together an exhibition at Milingimbi about the season cycles that existed in Arnhem Land. So instead of the 4 seasons, summer, winter, autumn, spring, there were actually 6 seasons that Aboriginal people used in Arnhem Land, as against the general white, the sophisticated white people of the Northern Territory, who talk about the wet and the dry. So I was trying to put that together, but that then morphed into an exhibition about taxonomy, about naming, because those names for those birds, plants, whatever, in that system quite often were also the names of people. People's names also meant this species of bird, this type of grass, this type of tree. They also existed as a name, a site within the landscape. So it was within those systems I put together an exhibition that eventually morphed and was shown at the Museum of Contemporary Art eventually, called The Native Born. Now that book, there were two parts to that. One was to exhibit the intense, very detailed, structured knowledge system that everyone seemingly kept in their head, as how they kept this complete book of list of birds, plants, animals, etc. That was part of it. But the other part of it was to actually get this collection, to maneuver to have this collection acquired by the Power Institute of Contemporary Art in Sydney University, so that Aboriginal art would also be confirmed as being a contemporary art practice. And it was very influential at the time. It was most probably almost the first major Australian art collected by the Power Institute. The Power Institute was set up by Djon Power, a gentleman doctor artist, but his purpose was to bring the art of the world to Australia, because Australia is full of culturalists, cretins and drongos and whatever, as you know, who like to have a beer and a barbecue but don't do much else. And he was to bring all those major Western, Picasso, blah, etc., contemporary artists to Australia to enlighten us. That's the purpose of it, really. This was to show, it changed the idea of the purpose of that bequest, changed in 1984 under a new directorship, who decided that Australians were very active in contemporary art generally, and the first and that they should be acquired. And so the first artworks were these artworks, nearly 300 art pieces from Remenginning in this exhibition.
Sorry to interrupt you, John. This is incredibly fascinating history. Unfortunately, we've got to move on to Kimberley. We don't have a lot of time, but I do want to acknowledge that you are such a holder of this history. You kind of know all these threads, and so it's really easy to sort of talk about that stuff. And I do want to talk a little bit about some quotes from your winning paper, of course. But what we might do now, if it's okay with you, is just let Kimberley talk through her slides at the moment, and then we can have a broader discussion as well. But thank you, John.
That's how I came to write.
It's a big story. It's a very big story.
Go.
Kim, would you mind?
Sure. Thanks, John. I could sit and listen to you all day. Yeah, so I had the privilege of being a part of a cohort that went to Dhaka, and it was a critical writing ensemble, and Djon was a part of that trip as well, along with many other amazing Indigenous writers from across the world and Australia. And then we ended up contributing to a book called Sovereign Words, Indigenous Art Curation and Criticism. And I wrote an essay called I Can Still Hear Them, and I've spelt it wrong, lol. Yes, I'm a writer. Yeah, but I can still hear them calling echoes of my ancestors. Whoops. And this really was a personal kind of narrative driven essay piece that also critically looked at the legacy of ethnographic collecting, ideas around authenticity, lots of different things, but it was kind of coming from my positionality as a Yorta Yorta woman, going into these places, but also working within these sort of colonial colonial frameworks coming from a museum background. One thing that sticks with me or has stuck with me for many, many years since reading it was this from Linda Tilby-Smith. And I won't read it to you because you can read it for yourself, but this concept of restoring a spirit, restoring the spirit to land, restoring the spirit to object and place through, you know, First Peoples ways of working and reclamation and agency. I hope my internet doesn't drop out. It's a little bit crappy. I'm in Darwin at a hotel. And so I'll move on from that. I had an anthropologist once ask me in a lecture in Brisbane why I photograph myself with collections, or why I get photos in the collections. And she actually said, why do you photograph with the subject? And response was, well, they're not subjects, they're you know, they're objects, they're not things to be studied or written about, they're objects from my ancestors and from other people's ancestors from across Australia. And it's like connecting to a long lost family member or someone that you haven't met before or that you haven't seen in a really long time. And when you do that, you often get a photo to remember that moment. So this is why, or part of the reason why I do that, where appropriate, of course. But another reason of why, you know, of where I've come from and also my essay, it's grounded in a storyline narrative, something that my uncle Wayne Atkinson has taught me and spoken to me about a lot. And it's about centering yourself from a place of family and community. And I do this also because, or I share these photos because these are photos of my family, I should say, that are held in the Museum of Victoria collections. Father standing out in front of the Cumbregunda Schoolhouse there on the far left-hand side. These are my nanas, Nanny Claire, my aunties, you know, and these are all objects in the museum that I also work for. So as Aboriginal people, we often have these sort of tensions of both our family and our work in these spaces. And this is a Yoda Yoda Possum Skin Cloak. And of course, there are these terrible histories that come with these places. And this is not isolated to any particular museum. Museums Victoria, along with every other museum in the country and across the world, have you know, these histories that are in many cases violent towards our people. The collection that I work in is the Southeastern collection. I'm the senior curator for that, and there's a big collection of photographs and ethnohistory material that go along with that. So this is just a little bit of my background and working, of course, with the First Peoples galleries and contemporary art spaces there. So leading into me writing this essay, this is kind of where I'm coming from. And this is also where I've been on different trips to research and to connect with our objects and place, and also the people that are keepers and carers and curators and collection managers of these places. So in the essay, which you can still read through, you can still buy through the Office for Contemporary Art Norway. And I should say also that Australia Council for the Arts and Art Space Sydney were, you know, they all kind of instigated this. So if it wasn't for them, I wouldn't have had the opportunity to write like this and kind of have the opportunity to think with all these amazing writers in Dhaka as well. But all of this kind of led me into writing in a way that was both connecting my personal narrative and my personal kind of story, but also critically looking at, you know, at these sort of collections and spaces. I came across, the essay, if you can't get the book, you can also contact me and I can send you it. I think I'm allowed to do that. You know, like of meeting objects, and this is one of those moments in Glasgow where I came across stone tools, you know, that were collected from Shepparton, from where I grew up and where my country is. And, you know, I'm constantly sort of meeting objects and you know, cultural belongings that I'm either connected to or I have, you know, family connected to. And, you know, it's quite a jarring kind of space to be in often, but it's also really important. I spoke about the Pigorini Museum in Rome and sort of being led into this weird auditorium space, and I wasn't allowed to go into the collection space, but it felt like a mausoleum. It looked like a one, and it was cold, and, you know, those objects hadn't been the moment they were taken, and many of these objects were from, well, the collection I looked at were from Victoria, and then there's also often Tasmanian material that gets put into this, as well as New South Wales material. So sort of moving through the process of connecting and sort of trying to communicate too in spaces that often, you know, aren't speaking English either. Of course, the British Museum, we all know the loot that they have, and it's an important place for our curator, Gay Sculthorpe, who's led a huge amount of research there, which is really fantastic. But these places, as I wrote in the essay, are very confronting, and kind of led me to kind of critically think about a lot of different things that win the essay. But I won't sort of go on for too long. But some of the ideas that I spoke about in the essay that was sparked by, not the first person to go into museums or to consider, you know, the way that contemporary practice and museology meet. But it was just sort of, I guess my essay was around my personal experience of that. And, you know, there was these myths that I kept coming across, convenient lies within the archive, you know, one around authenticity, and you know, there were objects that I came across where they spoke about, you know, the authenticity of the object. And these objects were collected, you know, very, very early invasion and settlement of Australia, where the specimen, you know, was impaired because it was made by a white man's tool. So the intangible knowledge was not considered, you know, in kind of the many thousands of generations of knowledge that it took to know how to make a shield if that person had used steel or glass. So these sort of ideas were starting to be, I guess, inspired, and I was thinking a lot around that, and influenced by these very colonial spaces and the mythology of, you know, our cultural practice when placed, you know, there's message sticks in this photo, for example, placed next to a vial from England that had a witch in it, apparently. And so, like, the placing of cultural material next to this sort of material and what that does to our culture. So the idea of loss of culture, of course, comes through. And we, of course, know that this isn't true. Our culture in the Southeast, and Jonathan spoke really strongly about that as well. You know, it's still strong. We're still holding this this knowledge. And so, you know, a lot of the work and the essay touches on this idea of the importance of contemporary practice and artists working within this space of the archive as well. And this is just an example, you know, there's just so many beautiful, like, links between what's happening in community in terms of reviving and regenerating and disrupting, and linking that to our old people's objects in collections. I spoke about the possum skin cloak and this idea of dormancy, and how the curator said, you know, time to go back to sleep now, when she closed the drawer on this possum skin cloak. And that was really disturbing for me to hear. And it wasn't her, it was actually her being very kind and sensitive to the object, but that caused me kind of concern, because I was thinking, well, if it's going to sleep, when is it going to wake up? And it might be another 5 years, you know, before someone else comes to see this or engages with it. So, you know, that I sort of spoke about that a little bit in this essay also. And of course, this other Cook shield, or shield that's attributed to Cook in the Berlin Museum as well, I spoke about. There was a section of my work, of my essay, that was titled "Strung Up," like strung up on a butcher's hook. And you know, this was really confronting, going into the Berlin Ethnographic Museum and seeing our cultural objects literally like strung up on butcher's hooks. And it was purely for a collection management kind of way of storing, but it just provoked a lot of thinking around this space and the legacy of ethnographic collecting. And this is another possum skin cloak in Berlin. So I suppose all of this, these experiences led to this essay, and these sort of, like the lament, I suppose, that I have and had often when I left, the objects in these spaces, but also how, we as an Indigenous curator, and as there's lots of other First Peoples working in these spaces that are trying to restore the spirit, of these objects and work with contemporary practice. But I'm been trying to kind of work within a framework of regenerate, disrupt, and revive. And this is a methodology that I'm working on that others have been doing for a long time before me as well. And that is it.
Thank you. Thanks, Kim. I'm really interested. The reason why I loved your essay so much was because it comes at things from a very personal perspective, and often I think in the kind of the traditions of art curation and certainly museological curation, people have been encouraged to other people's cultural material. And it is very difficult to start othering when you are confronted with a first-person account of a connection to objects or to material, and what the representation of that material has made that person feel. And I think that was for me, that really shifted some thinking about, how do we get other people to understand, non-Indigenous writers to understand that actually for us, this is very, very personal at all times. So thank you so much for that. Now, I want to talk, we haven't got lots and lots of time left, and I've got 1,000 questions on my paper, so I'm going to pick out some ones that hopefully the audience might want to hear. I do want to ask about sort of very broadly the role of art criticism in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander discourse or contexts. Personally, I think language is a weapon and we can weaponize language. So that's something that I'm really interested in. But when I spoke to some of you prior to this, we talked about different modalities of writing. And I want to throw that initially to you, Kim. We had a bit of a chat about that. I mean, what's the, in terms of art criticism, particularly art criticism about Black artists, Black communities, First Nations art, what's the sort of role of the oral, the spoken word? How can we, given often art criticism is in English, what do we do with that? Can we change that and transform that in different ways? So I'm going to throw that first to you, Kim, and then I'm going to open it up.
All of that, I think. I think we also spoke about, I guess, the role of the editor, and like if we're thinking about art criticism or writing in a context of like Australian art magazines or publications, or doesn't have to be Australian, wherever, like how influential the editor can be in the way that we write as well. And I've even had issues before where I really don't like when I write about artists, and often I know them, or I have personal relationships to them, or I am family or whatever, but I don't like using their last name. I find it a very dislocating way of writing, referring to Bullen or whatever, in the essay. And I've always had a lot of pushback from editors on that. And that's just a personal methodology that I'm trying to embed in the way that I write. I suppose I think the representation, and I know Chloe and Djon, and certainly like all of you actually have been like pushing for more writing and mentorship and representation across, all the different platforms for First Peoples writers. And that's important from the editor to the person doing the writing. I think, like my piece was a personal kind of narrative driven piece. And that, we should, I think Stephen touched on it before, like different ways of knowledge and different ways of expressing knowledge. Like I can write a diary entry piece, and I can also like do a PhD, which I'm doing now. Like like, so there's like, we can, as First Peoples, as mob, like working in these spaces, we constantly have to shift in and out of, I don't know what the correct term would be, but like modes, I suppose, of working for our mob, for our communities, but also within this Western world.
We are excellent code shifters.
That's right. Yeah. So I'm not sure if I've answered your question, but
no, absolutely. I mean, Cara, you and I talked about it as well, and you talked a little bit about also sort of having to educate other people about the language and the terminology they're using, and educating them about, you know, how you offer feedback and all those sorts of things. Did you want to elaborate that a little bit?
Yeah, thanks, Chloe. I mean, I guess one of the things we were talking about the other day is the use of language when you're writing texts in English, and how there aren't necessarily easy definitions to find for particular words in language that capture that particular word in its full form. So often there's a really inferior definition that is provided alongside words. And I think in terms of my writing, and I guess some of the things I've been pushing in work at the gallery, is not offering a definition, actually using those language words, not offering a definition that isn't enough, and really asking the audience to do their work. And if they don't know that word, as they would in any other language, to actually look that word up and find out what that word means, so that they have a better understanding of that word in language then can be offered, you know, in a text that's X number of words long. And I think there's been great resistance to that over a number of years, but I think there is a shift starting to happen as people come to know some of the words that are used sort of more prolifically in terms of particular areas of practice across the country. And I guess I hope that into the future that those words can be used, that immediately understood. You don't need a definition, you don't need to look them up, that they actually become part of our language about art practice from particular areas of the country. And would be much more meaningful than, you know, certain other words that we spoke about. I mean, I was talking about the word traditional the other day, Chloe, and how that's kind of banned from many texts that I write, because I think it says nothing. It kind of is used as a form of sort of implying a sense of authenticity and culture in a particular moment that doesn't allow for the dynamic changing nature of culture. And I guess a challenge I've put to some of the people that I've worked with is delete the traditionals and see if the meaning of your text changes. And most of the time it doesn't need to be there. And so I think we often fall into traps with language as well, because that's how we've heard particular art forms being written about or spoken about, and it's hard to work against them. At times you have to be really conscious of shifting those things.
Yeah, my personal hated word is explore. I hate the word explore for all kinds of reasons, but for obvious reasons when it comes to speaking about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultural material. Djon, your essay, which Nicholas has shared on the chat, I loved it so much. And what I loved about it was that what you talked about in it was the Great Australian Silence. So you talked about the fact that, you know, this kind of writing where particularly in your essay, it draws together the reasons for why you did what you did, the reasons for it's particularly focusing on the Aboriginal memorial, and then the kind of outcomes that came out of that. How important do you think it is to sort of for Black sort of critical arts writing to address the Great Australian Silence? Like what do we do with that?
Well, it's sort of a cliche in a way that by writing you're breaking the silence. But you've got to remember that if you don't do it, no one else will. That's what you've got to remember. And I think also that if you don't talk about your own family, well, no one else will. And those things or you don't talk about your particular background or where your family comes from, or no one else will write those things. Now, you know, we all know Emily Bronte's novels. We all know it's about a particular set of young white English middle-class women in a particular time. It's those kinds of stories. If you don't write those stories, your own, then no one else will. And it's a time, in my time of writing that essay, was to explain myself, well, I don't have to explain myself, but I wanted to explain why I did things, because you have to get your voice in before someone else writes your story. They will have their own particular bent on it, and certainly with the particular essay that I won that award for, it's a very contentious issue about the recognition of Aboriginal people being murdered by, in hundreds of thousands of instances, people being murdered. It's about an attempt at genocide that didn't happen, that was somehow we escaped it, but I had to get that out first. I make a joke that it's so funny that you have to write your own catalogue essay, then you have to write your own review, but it's
not too far from the truth, is it? I mean, no. Unfortunately, it's still actually not too far from the truth. Well, and I think, your point about us getting in there and writing our own stories first before anyone else does has absolute pertinence when we're talking about critical arts writing and art criticism, because what's happened for many years is that people have criticised our shows or, and ourselves and othered us. And what that does, for me, the importance of all of this is having the agency and being empowered enough to actually write our own stories and have that acknowledged and respected as being authentic and real and honest and truly, contributing to the history of this country. We've always had to do it in particular ways. And I do wonder, with the change in kind of platforms at the moment, what sorts of platforms are people thinking might be the new avenues where we can, I'm particularly thinking of digital platforms at the moment, but there's lots of others. Kim, do you have any ideas about that?
I still think there's like the more traditional platforms of print media and newspapers and things that we still don't have a strong voice in. We may have, the odd Indigenous writer in these places doing a review, but I think we need to, I think there needs to be more of a representation and push still in those platforms. I think certainly like digital now is obviously the way that we're all going to have to go for many years into the future. And it's, wonderful that we can all Zoom and do these kind of things. But I'd like to see more writing, in different kind of papers and journals and things like that also, I guess, historically have a very like white art historian presence that speak about us and write about us. And I want to see more mob, holding those spaces. And that's, I think that's the power in that. And I think also mob, having the opportunity to critically or critique our work, each other's work, and how do we do that without being perceived as laterally violent, or how do we do that without, and it's about being informed, and it's about being sensitive and articulate and all of these different things. It's not just like poo-pooing on someone's work. It's actually about critically looking at that, and that's how we all get better and engage in different ways. So I'd like to sort of see more of that happening as well in reviews.
That's a really big one, actually, because I think there's been a lot of fear. Certainly I have it. I don't know if you guys share it, but you might, there's been enough kind of an impact of non-Indigenous people writing about Aboriginal artists' works and completely fucking it up, basically. And so, from my perspective, I don't want to then keep perpetuating that by writing something horrible about an artist's work or practice. But also at the same time, what happens then is we don't have a rigor to all of our practices and what we're doing. So, I mean, I don't know the answer to that, but Cara, Djon, I'll open that up to you guys. Like, how do you feel about that? Is that a barrier? Is that?
Well, most probably the two parts to are that you actually do get asked to write something, or you do write something. That's great. Yeah. I'm doing a project called the Dingo Project next week, but anyway.
Sorry about that.
My dingo is calling me, but that's the first part, is actually to be able to get into an article, get into a magazine, to get into a publication. And then of course the other thing is that possibly that you know that a culture has really arrived when you can write something internally, you can write something critical with that it's not taken that you should never criticize anyone. And I've written a couple of critical articles where I thought it was what I thought was necessary. But of course, and then you're attacked because, you shouldn't attack your fellow Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander artist. But in fact, you have to, the cultural life must reach a point where you can actually do that. You must be able to say, well, look, this isn't good. This is not a good example, or this is a weak piece of art. But that's a very really hard line, or big.
It is.
Yeah, line to walk along. And I quite often would say, oh, well, this work was most probably a little bit too ambitious, something like that, rather than that this was a complete failure or whatever. Which is those stereotyped things of attacking other people's art. That that was it.
Yeah, it's really tough. It's really tough. This is my little secret that I'll share with the millions of people here. I often use the word interesting when I don't want to attack something, but actually feel sort of uncomfortable about the resolution of the work or whatever else in it, because it's difficult to know as an Aboriginal woman what words to use for Aboriginal art as well, because we are not, no one teaches us that. We have to, as we've all done, kind of center ourselves in that and decide how we're going to proceed. Cara, you were going to say something before just about, do you feel uncomfortable with having to do that? And
yeah, I think it is uncomfortable, but I think it's all something that we're really sort of yearning for and wanting, to be more of a critical dialogue around our writing, around exhibitions, around a number of things. But I think there's a hesitancy there because you know how hard it has been for each of those individuals to be able to present that exhibition, to deliver that text. And so I think, which is one of, I think, the real positives about those of us working in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander art, that you want to support one another rather than cut people down. And I think that's a huge benefit to us and how we work. And it is finding that balance, but I would hope that over time, as there is kind of, more strength in numbers and more texts out there, that we could get to that point and it's seen as constructive rather than critical.
Yeah, I think. So, Kim, were you going to say, yeah?
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I really agree. And I think you make a good point, Cara, in terms of how hard it is often to get to that point. And Djon, also how hard it is to get to a point of even being invited to write or having the opportunity to write in these spaces, or the opportunity to put on a show, because there are multiple barriers often, to get to that point. So it's complex. Yeah,
it's deeply complex. We are at 3:00, but I have had the approval to go a little bit over time, which is good. And I do want to, there was a question actually that was asked, and we won't be able to get through all of them, but there was something from Marnie, thank you, that touched a little bit, or the question touched a little bit on what we were talking about before. There's a question from many people who are wanting to be advocates and do the right thing. And so lots of people have asked this question, but this one's on here. It says, in terms of creating infrastructures or spaces around writing, publishing, research, what do you think would make the most difference to your work in communities in terms of, so some of the goals that have been stated here are Indigenous-led editorial board, Indigenous editor position, first language delivery, multimodal formats that don't privilege text. So what would make the most difference, do you think, in terms of being afforded some of those luxuries of being able to speak in the way that we might want to speak?
I think I'll just throw it out that you've basically got to keep practicing in all my thing of curating and whatever and making art. You've just got to keep practicing and take every opportunity, and it will wear you out. It will drive you mad. You'll be talking about something ridiculous that you never would have thought about. But just keep practicing. You've got to keep going at everything you can.
Is it just about resourcing? Is it just about having more copy editors or more writers, or is it something more than that, Cara or Kim?
I think it is all of that. I think it is about people in a variety of positions and that kind of wider support network. I think it's about resourcing as well in terms of the development of projects and kind of making things happen in a range of institutions from small to large right across the country. And I think it's also creating opportunities for those who don't necessarily have the capacity and the infrastructure at the moment to be writing, such as people in Milingimbi. I mean, wouldn't it have been fantastic if that publication wasn't written by me, that there was actually the infrastructure within Milingimbi for that publication to have come from everyone in the community rather than me, in a way translating their words into the text in that book. And I guess one of the ways I think about that particular project is it's just the first step in an ongoing relationship, and that there is an obligation to continue that relationship and to continue doing projects with people in Milingimbi, so that hopefully over time there can be a shift in the power dynamics really that are in that book as well, and that, you know, at some stage, you know, curators within institutions aren't the main voice necessarily in publications like that, and that is happening, but I think it would be amazing if we got to the point where that was the norm.
Yeah.
Sorry, you go, Kim.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I'd also like to see, like, you know, you see these reviews in papers often by, you know, like old white guys that are going to these shows that are not understanding how to interpret Aboriginal art, that you know, or they go to the National, or they go to these, you know, big exhibitions, and they're just really not getting it. And, you know, I'd like to have like an Aboriginal reviewer up alongside, so like let them have their article, but then actually have an Aboriginal person doing the same thing in the same paper, and see, you know, both sides, like these two ways of looking, and that, I think, like more of that. Okay, I think obviously I'm an advocate for more, you know, in these spaces, but to also, you know, to have both voices, because it's always more of the other. And so balancing that out, and and that kind of interpretation and reviewing of shows, we need more balance in that space. And I think, you know, mentorship is really important, and it has been for me, and it will continue to be. And Djon's, you know, words of keep writing, keep practicing, write a catalogue, document, like these have been things that we've spoken about and he's spoken about for many years to me, and have actually really influenced the way I think and do. And to have mentors, you know, like Djon and other people in these spaces, that's so important for young writers and all of us, you know, as we write. Yeah.
I had a writer, an art critic from The Australian, who refused to come to Richard Bell's show with the rest of the journos when we opened, refused to come to it. And for reasons that were ridiculous and condescending and horrific, frankly. And I think part of the reason that he wouldn't come was that he was confronted by having to write about something he knew absolutely nothing about. And that's part of the reason why we shouldn't be letting people like that write about our work and our cultural material, but also why we desperately need more Indigenous art criticism. I think we've pretty much run out of time, haven't we? We've gone over. Stephen, I'll bring you back in. So this is your seminar. So well, thank you. Thank you so much. Sorry, Stephen. Thank you so much, Djon, Kim, and Cara. From the bottom of my heart, we could talk for the next hour about this. It's a really important topic, but I've appreciated you sharing with us today. Thank you.
I'd like to add my thanks as well. I've been really energized by your necessary and urgent discussions about the state of Indigenous art writing. And I just want to thank you for sharing your time, your courage, your wisdom with us today. It's really uplifting to hold space with you and share space with you. And I've already learned so much from your writings, and my students do too. And I've also benefited from your compassionate critique throughout my career as well. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what's yet to come. I'd like to thank Chloe for your expert moderating today, and hope I can get to see you all in reality very soon. I'd also like to thank all our attendees. Thank you very much for participating in today's symposium. It has literally taken many years for this to happen, but I'd like to thank the people near and far who've helped contribute and support this event. We'd like to thank our judges, Donna Leslie, Ian McLean, Peter Minter, Clothilde Bullen, Matt Poll and Mark Ledbury, as well as the Copyright Agency Cultural Fund for making the awards possible, as well as the past and present Power staff, Nick, Marnie, Tom and Katie, and Mark for coordinating and administering the awards. So thank you for supporting today's event, and I hope that it inspires many more disruptions. So thank you very much.